A dying bobcat used her final energy to grab his boot, the reason why I made him adopt her, in the frozen silence of the wilderness. It's a man stumbles upon a wild creature on the edge of death. But instead of letting go, the animal fights with, her last breath clawing at his boot, refusing to release him. And clenched in her jaws is something no one could explain. What he uncovers next will pull him into a fight far bigger than he ever imagined, where survival, betrayal, and an unthinkable bond will collide. A hidden truth waits in the shadows, one that could destroy everything, or transform his life forever. Why would a dying predator use her last strength to reach for him? And what secret is buried in the wilderness that could change his life forever? Before we start, take a moment to comment your name or city. It's my way of remembering that behind each play is a real heartbeat. The morning frost crunched under Daniel Hargrave's worn work boots as he made his daily rounds along the ranch's fence line. The autumn air bit at his exposed face, but he barely noticed anymore. After 15 years of working other people's land, the cold had become just another companion in his solitary life. Daniel's weathered hands, marked by years of manual labor, adjusted the collar of his canvas jacket against the wind. The rising sun cast long shadows across the Montana landscape, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of gold and silver. It was the kind of morning that usually brought him peace. Just him, the land, and the distant cry of morning birds. He'd learned early on that being invisible had its advantages. Growing up in foster homes taught him that lesson well. Keep your head down, do your work, and trouble usually passes you by. The ranch owners barely knew his name, and that suited him just fine. He was good at being forgotten. But this morning would be different. Visibility wasn't an option. He spotted it first as an unusual dark shape near the western fence line, something that didn't belong among the familiar patterns of grass and wood posts. Daniel's steps slowed as he approached, his trained eye noting the disturbed earth and bent grass leading to the shape. The bobcat lay crumpled in the dirt, its normally proud form broken and bloody. Daniel had seen plenty of injured wildlife before, and his first instinct was to leave nature to take its course. But something about this scene felt wrong. The blood wasn't from a mountain lion attack or a run-in with barbed wire. There were strange marks on its body, like it had been caught in something mechanical. Easy there, he muttered, though he knew. The animal was beyond hearing. He took another step closer, preparing to continue his rounds. That's when it happened. The bobcat's eyes snapped open, amber orbs filled with an intensity that froze Daniel in place. With what must have been its last reserves of strength, the creature's paw shot out, claws catching the leather of his boot. The desperate gesture wasn't an attack, it was a plea. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something in the bobcat's slightly parted jaws, a scrap of fabric, dirty and torn, with something else tangled in it. His hands trembled slightly as he knelt down, careful not to make any sudden moves. The bobcat's grip on his boot weakened, but those eyes remained fixed on him. Burning with purpose, with gentle movements, Daniel reached for the fabric. The bobcat didn't resist as he carefully extracted it from her mouth. His fingers unwound the material, and his heart nearly stopped. There, wrapped in the dirty cloth, was a child's shoelace, bright blue with little cartoon characters on it, now stained with mud and blood. "What happened to you?" he whispered, his voice rough with sudden emotion. "Where did you find this?" The bobcat's breathing was becoming more labored, but she maintained that intense eye contact. Daniel had spent enough time around animals too. No, when they were trying to communicate something. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was a message. He noticed more details now. The bobcat's injuries looked like they came from heavy machinery. Maybe bulldozers. He'd heard rumors about development happening in the canyon several miles away, but he'd kept his distance. From local politics, that's what invisible people did. The bobcat's chest heaved one final time, and those fierce eyes slowly dimmed. But the intensity of her final moments lingered in the crisp morning air. Daniel stood up slowly, the shoelace and fabric clutched in his hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. His years of keeping his head down, of letting the world pass him by, suddenly felt like cowardice. a child's. Shoelace doesn't end up in a dying bobcat's mouth by accident. Something was terribly wrong, and for whatever reason, this creature had chosen him, the Invisible Man, to do something about it. Daniel looked toward the canyon, where the morning sun was just beginning to illuminate the distant cliffs. His simple routine of fence mending and cattle checking seemed very far away now. The bobcat had given her last breath to deliver this message. He couldn't ignore it. He carefully wrapped the shoelace and fabric in his bandana and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then, with a gentleness that surprised even him, he lifted the bobcat's body and carried it to a patch of soft earth beneath an old pine tree. She deserved better than to be left in the dirt by the fence. As he covered her with pine needles and stones, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The comfortable numbness of invisibility was cracking, revealing something he'd buried long ago, a sense of purpose, responsibility to something larger than himself. The morning was still cold, the frost still thick on the grass, but Daniel Hargrave was no longer the same man who had started his rounds that day. A dying bobcat had chosen him, had literally reached out and grabbed him, forcing him to see what he'd been avoiding for so long. Something was wrong in the canyon, and somewhere a child needed help. He stood up from the makeshift grave, brushing the dirt from his knees. The weight of the shoelace in his pocket felt like a promise he couldn't break. His days of being invisible were over. The morning frost crunched under Daniel Hargrave's worn work boots as he made his daily rounds along the ranch's fence line. The autumn air bit at his exposed face, but he barely noticed anymore. After 15 years of working other people's land, cold had become just another companion in his solitary life. Daniel's weathered hands, marked by years of manual labor, adjusted the collar of his canvas jacket against the wind. The rising sun cast long shadows across the Montana landscape, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of gold and silver. That's when he saw her, the bobcat, her fur matted with blood, lying in a heap near the fence post. He stood frozen, staring at the wounded creature, her sides heaved with labored breaths, and those fierce amber eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him step back. Years of working ranch land had taught him to keep his distance from wild animals, especially injured ones. The smart thing would be to walk away, let nature take its course. But as he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The bobcat lunged forward with her remaining strength, her claws catching the leather of his boot. The action wasn't aggressive. It was desperate. In her bloody jaws, she held something that made Daniel's heart skip a beat, a torn piece of fabric with a child's shoelace dangling from it. Daniel knelt down slowly, his mind racing. The fabric was bright purple, definitely not from his clothes or any ranch equipment. The shoelace was small, the kind you'd find on a child's sneaker. His hands trembled as he carefully took the items from the bobcat's weakening grip. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, knowing full well the animal couldn't answer. The bobcat's eyes seemed to plead with him, and in that moment, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. He had always been the invisible one, the quiet ranch hand that nobody noticed or listened to. But now someone, maybe a child, needed help. Looking around, he began to notice details he'd overlooked before. There were marks in the dirt, small footprints partially obscured by the morning frost, broken twigs on the nearby brush, bent at unnatural angles. Something or someone had passed through here, and recently, Daniel began following the trail, his years of tracking cattle now serving a different purpose. The footprints were small, definitely a child's, and they weren't straight or purposeful. They wandered, zigzagged, like someone lost or confused. His stomach tightened as he noticed larger prints overlapping the small ones in places. The evidence was building into a picture he didn't want to see. A child in trouble. Maybe worse. The thought of ignoring it made him sick to his stomach. He'd been ignored himself too many times in his life, bounced between foster homes, overlooked for. Promotions, dismissed by society. Couldn't do the same to someone else, especially not a kid. Not a kid. The trail led him about half a mile before becoming too faint to follow. Daniel marked the spot with his bandana tied to a branch and headed straight for his truck. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the sheriff's station, the fabric and shoelace. Carefully wrapped in his handkerchief, the station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel approached the front desk. Sheriff Carlton Mays sat behind it, his uniform straining against his substantial belly, a half-eaten donut leaving crumbs in his graying mustache. "Well, if it ain't the quiet man himself," Mays drawled, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. "What brings you out of the shadows, Hargrave?" Daniel placed the handkerchief on the desk. "Found something this morning, Sheriff. Think we might have a missing child?" That got Mays's attention, though not in the way Daniel hoped. The sheriff's face reddened as he examined the items, his expression shifting from annoyance to dismissal. "Where exactly did you find these?" Mays asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Near the north fence line of the Peterson place?" "There was a wounded bobcat." "A bobcat," Mays interrupted, letting out a wheezing laugh that showed more donut crumbs. "You mean to tell me you got this from a wild animal? Was dying, Sheriff?" "But she brought it to me. There were footprints, too, small ones, and signs of listen here." Hargrave Mays cut him off again, pushing the handkerchief back across the desk. "We ain't got any reports of missing children. What we do have is a lot of folks trying to make trouble where there ain't none. Scrap of cloth from a wild animal don't mean anything, except maybe it found someone's laundry." Daniel stood his ground. "Sir, if you'd just come look at the trail," I said. "We're done here." Mays's voice hardened. "Unless you want me talking to your boss about how you're wasting police time with fairy tales about talking bobcats?" The threat wasn't subtle. Daniel felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time it was different. This time, someone else might pay the price for his silence. He picked up the handkerchief, his jaw tight. "At least keep the fabric," he said, quietly, "in case someone does report a missing child. Get out of my office, Hargrave. Some of us have real work to do." Daniel walked out of the station, the morning sun now high and harsh in the sky. The sheriff's laughter followed him, but it couldn't drown out the memory of those desperate amber eyes or the sight of those small footprints in the dirt. He might be the only one who believed something was wrong, but maybe that was enough. Maybe being invisible didn't mean he had to be blind. Daniel traced the faint prints in the dirt, his fingers hovering over each subtle depression. Years of tracking cattle had taught him to read stories in the earth, but these marks were different, smaller, more urgent. He found himself following a trail marked by scuffed earth and broken twigs, each sign pointing deeper into the wilderness beyond the ranch's boundaries. The morning sun climbed higher as he worked his way through the brush, carefully documenting everything with his phone's camera. Though Sheriff Mays had dismissed him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't ordinary signs. A candy wrapper here, a disturbed patch of grass there, all telling a story he couldn't ignore. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him look up. A dusty white truck with Wildlife Rescue painted on its side pulled up nearby. A woman in her early 40s climbed out, her sandy blonde hair tied back in a practical ponytail. She wore sturdy hiking boots and a vest filled with rescue gear. "Must be Daniel Hargrave," she called out, walking toward him with purpose. "I'm Leona Price. Sheriff Mays mentioned you found an injured bobcat." Daniel straightened up, automatically tensing for another dismissal. She's dead now. But there's more to it than just a wounded animal. To his surprise, Leona didn't immediately walk away. Instead, she crouched down beside the tracks he'd been examining. "Tell me everything," she said simply. Daniel hesitated, then pulled out the purple fabric and shoelace from his pocket. "The bobcat brought me these. She was trying to show me something. I know how that sounds, but no," Leona interrupted. Studying the items closely, it doesn't sound crazy at all. Animals are smarter than most people give them credit for. I've seen mother bears lead rescuers to their trapped cubs. If this bobcat was trying to communicate something, we need to pay attention. Relief washed over Daniel. For the first time since finding the bobcat, he felt his shoulders relax slightly. "There's a trail," he explained, pointing to the signs he'd found. "Small footprints, broken branches at kid height, these wrappers from children's snacks." Leona pulled out her own phone, documenting the evidence. "The bobcat's den was in this area," she said thoughtfully. "It was destroyed recently by some development work. She might have witnessed something while looking for a new home." Daniel showed her the photos he'd taken, explaining his tracking process. Leona listened intently, asking sharp questions that showed she understood the language of the wild as well as he did. Together, they pushed deeper into the brush, finding more disturbing signs. "Look at this," Leona said, pointing to a small backpack partially hidden under some leaves. "This is too organized to be random garbage." She carefully pulled out the backpack, revealing a child's lunchbox inside. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Sheriff Mays said there weren't any missing children reported in the area. "That doesn't mean there isn't one," Leona replied grimly. "Sometimes the absence of a report is exactly what we should be worried about." They continued their search, marking locations on their phones and photographing everything. The signs led them to a clearing where they found more evidence. A small shoe print pressed into mud, recently discarded food wrappers, and broken branches that suggested someone had passed through in a hurry. "These aren't the marks of someone just wandering lost," Leona observed, her expression serious. "These signs show purpose, someone moving with intent, possibly trying to stay hidden." Daniel nodded, remembering the desperate look in the Bobcat's eyes. She knew something was wrong. "That's why she brought me the evidence, instead of just dying quietly." Leona stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Listen, Daniel, I deal with a lot of officials in my work. I know when someone has good instincts, and yours are spot on. Whatever's happening here isn't natural, and we need to figure it out." "You really believe me?" Daniel asked, still unused to being taken seriously. "I believe in reading the signs," Leona replied firmly. "And everything here is screaming that something's very wrong. I need to keep searching. But we also need to be smart about this. Whatever we're dealing with, it's bigger than a lost child wandering in the woods." They spent the next hour methodically documenting every piece of evidence they could find. Leona's experience with wildlife rescue added another layer to their investigation, helping them understand how the Bobcat's behavior fit into the larger picture. "The Bobcat chose you for a reason," Leona said, as they marked their final findings. "Animals can sense who will listen. Did the right thing by following up, no matter what the sheriff said." For Daniel, who had spent his life being overlooked and dismissed, Leona's words carried special weight. In her, he'd found not just an ally, but someone who understood that sometimes the most important stories were told in the quietest ways. Through disturbed earth, broken twigs, and the final actions of a dying animal trying to right a wrong, Leona's eyes narrowed as she studied the fabric and shoelace. "Most people would have walked right past this," she said thoughtfully. "But you stopped. Why?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unused to someone taking his observations seriously. The Bobcat, she wasn't just injured. She was desperate, like she was trying to tell me something before she died. Together they followed the trail deeper into the brush. Leona proved to be as methodical as Daniel, photographing each piece of evidence they found. Small footprints led them to a clearing where the ground told a darker story. "Look at these tire tracks." Daniel pointed to heavy treads crushed into the earth. "Construction equipment. Recent 2 or 3 days old?" Leona crouched down, running her fingers along the torn-up ground. "These aren't maintenance vehicles. These are demolition tracks." She stood up, her face grim. "I've seen this pattern before, usually when Cliff Rayner's expanding his holdings." They pressed on, finding more disturbing signs. Child's backpack, partially buried under fresh dirt, scattered remains of a campsite, cheap plastic plates, a battered cooking pot, everything crushed and broken. Most telling was a charred patch of earth, where someone had tried to maintain a small fire. "Someone was living here," Daniel said. "Quietly, not camping. Living." Leona nodded grimly. "Squatters, probably. There's been more of them since Rayner started buying up all the affordable properties in the county. Some families can't afford to go anywhere else." They discovered more evidence of hasty departure, clothes scattered in the dirt, broken toys, a child's drawing fluttering from a branch. Each item painted a clearer picture of desperate people forced to flee. "Rayner's been getting aggressive lately," Leona explained as they documented everything. "He buys land, then uses any means necessary to clear it. Legal notices if you're lucky. Bulldozers if you're not." Daniel remembered the heavy machinery. "Trax, do you think he ran these people off?" "I know he did. Leona pulled out her phone, showing Daniel news articles. 3 complaints filed against him this month alone. All dismissed. He's got the sheriff's department in his pocket. That explained Maze's reaction. Daniel felt a cold anger building in his chest. So a family was living here, trying to survive. Raynor sends in his crews to destroy their camp. And in the chaos, a child gets separated. Leona finished. Probably scared, running blind into the wilderness. They found more proof of Raynor's methods: fresh bulldozer damage to trees, crushed belongings half buried in newly turned earth. Dowd. Everything spoke of violent, sudden displacement. The Bobcat must have found the child, Daniel said, piecing it together. That's why she came to me. She was trying to help. Leona's expression softened. Wildlife's got more heart than some humans. Question is, what do we do now? Raynor's got influence everywhere. Even with all this evidence, the sheriff won't touch him. Daniel stared at the small shoe print preserved in a patch of mud. Someone's child was out there, lost and afraid, because a wealthy man decided profit mattered more than people. The same system that had failed him as an orphan was failing this child now. We keep looking, he said firmly. Raynor might own the sheriff, but he doesn't own this land. Not really. Every track, every broken branch, they're telling us where to go. We just have to listen. Leona studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're right. But we need to be careful. Raynor doesn't like people interfering with his property development.
8.
He's been known to hire private security to handle trespassers. They spent the next hour documenting everything meticulously. GPS coordinates, photographs, measurements. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic displacement, with a child caught in the crossfire. We'll need help, Leona said as they finished. I know some people, journalists, advocacy groups. They've been trying to build a case against Raynor for years. This might be what they need. Daniel looked at the small items they'd collected. The shoelace, the drawing, the broken toys. Each one represented a fragment of a life disrupted by greed. Whatever it takes, he said quietly. That child deserves better than being collateral damage in Raynor's land grab. As they prepared to press deeper into the wilderness, a distant sound of heavy machinery echoed through the trees. Raynor's crews were still at work, destroying more makeshift homes, perhaps creating more victims. But now they had proof of his methods, and more importantly, they had a purpose. The sun was high overhead as Daniel and Leona gathered their evidence and planned their next move. They both knew they were taking on a powerful enemy, but neither could walk away. Somewhere in these woods, a child needed help. And unlike Cliff Raynor, they intended to answer that need. The wounded Bobcat stumbled forward. Her once graceful movements now halting and pained. Blood matted her tawny fur, but her amber eyes burned with fierce determination as she looked back at Daniel and Leona. Despite her injuries, she pressed onward, limping yet purposeful. I've never seen anything like this, Leona whispered, her camera forgotten at her side. She's leading us somewhere specific. Daniel nodded, his eyes tracking the Bobcat's careful progress. At first, he doubted his own instincts about the animal's behavior, but now there was no denying it. Every few yards, she would stop and wait, her gaze fixed on them until they caught up. The narrow canyon loomed ahead, its walls rising steep and forbidding against the autumn sky. Here, the evidence of human activity became more pronounced. Crushed vegetation marked recent footpaths, and discarded food wrappers fluttered against rocks. Look, Daniel said softly, pointing to a small pink hair tie caught in a thorny bush. Someone's been through here recently. The Bobcat's ears suddenly pricked forward. She froze, her body tensing. Before Daniel could react, the rumble of approaching vehicles echoed through the canyon. The sound of men's voices carried on the wind. Quick, Leona hissed, pulling Daniel behind a large boulder. Raynor's men. They pressed themselves against the cold stone as 2 pickup trucks appeared around the bend. The vehicles stopped, and 4 men climbed out, their boots crunching on loose gravel. Boss wants this whole area cleared, one man called out. No exceptions. Daniel's heart hammered. In his chest, the only way forward was up, along the icy ledges that traced the canyon's edge. He caught Leona's eye and gestured upward. She nodded grimly. They began their careful ascent, using natural handholds in the rock face, the Bobcat displaying surprising agility despite her wounds found her own path above them. Ice coated many of the surfaces, making each step treacherous. Halfway up, Daniel heard a sharp intake of breath from Leona. The ledge beneath her feet had started to crumble. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm just as the rock gave way completely. For one heart-stopping moment, Leona dangled over the drop, held only by Daniel's grip. Years of ranch work had given him strong hands, and now he used every ounce of that strength to pull her to safety. "The whole section's unstable," he whispered, once she'd caught her breath. "See how the color changes in the rock? That lighter patch means it's ready to break away." Leona stared at him. "How did you know that?" Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable. "With the attention, you spend enough time in these hills, you learn to read them. Like tracking animals, everything leaves signs if you know what to look for." Above them, the Bobcat waited patiently, her tail twitching. Despite her injuries, she moved with surprising sureness across the treacherous terrain. It was as if she knew exactly which paths would hold and which would crumble. They continued their climb, Daniel now taking the lead. His eyes scanned each section before they moved forward, noting subtle changes in the rock face that spoke of stability or danger. When they reached a particularly narrow ledge, he held up his hand. "Wait," he said, studying the ice-covered surface. "This whole shelf is ready to go. We need to move one at a time and stay close to the wall." Below, they could hear Raynor's men searching the canyon floor, their voices echoing off the walls. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows that made the ice even more treacherous. Daniel went first, pressing his body against the canyon wall, testing each step before committing his weight. The ledge held, but barely. Small pieces of rock skittered down into the growing darkness below. Now he called softly to Leona. "Move exactly where I did." She followed his path precisely, her breathing steady despite the danger. Just as she reached him, a larger chunk of rock broke free. Tumbling down the canyon wall, they froze, listening for any reaction from below. The Bobcat watched their progress with what seemed like impatience, her tail twitching more rapidly now. When they finally reached her position, she immediately turned and continued along the ridge, clearly intent on their destination. "She knows where she's going," Leona said quietly. "Whatever happened to her, whatever she's trying to show us, it's important enough that she's fighting through those injuries to lead us there." Daniel nodded, remembering the desperate look in the animal's eyes when she'd first grabbed his boot. There was intelligence there, and purpose. Whatever they were about to discover, he knew it would change everything. They pressed on, following the Bobcat's lead, while staying alert for any signs of pursuit from below. The canyon walls had begun to narrow, forcing them onto ever more precarious paths. But Daniel's instincts proved true each time, guiding them safely across sections that looked solid, but would have collapsed under their weight. The sun had almost completely set when they heard the engines of the pickup trucks start up. Again, the sound of the vehicles fading into the distance brought temporary relief, but Daniel knew they couldn't relax yet. They were too exposed up here, too vulnerable to both human threat and natural danger. The Bobcat had stopped again, her head turned toward something ahead that neither Daniel nor Leona could yet see. Despite her obvious pain and exhaustion, her eyes still burned with that same fierce determination that had marked her every move. Since they began this journey, the wounded Bobcat led them deeper into the canyon, her movements growing more urgent despite her failing strength. The steep walls cast long shadows in the late afternoon light, creating an eerily silent corridor of rock and scattered brush. Daniel and Leona followed cautiously, their footsteps crunching on loose gravel. Suddenly, the Bobcat stopped at a pile of freshly turned earth and debris. Daniel's heart sank as he took in the scene before them. What had once been a natural den was now a mess of bulldozed dirt and broken branches. Heavy tire tracks scarred the ground, telling a story of mechanical violence. Violence. "This was her home," Leona said softly, kneeling to examine the destruction. Look at these claw marks on the remaining roots. She had cubs here. Daniel crouched beside her, his fingers tracing the deep gouges in the exposed tree roots. The bobcat watched them intently, her amber eyes filled with a pain that went beyond her physical wounds. She let out a low, mournful sound that made Daniel's chest tighten. The den was deliberately destroyed, he said, anger rising in his voice. Raynor's men must have come through here with their equipment, clearing everything in their path. Leona picked up a small tuft of fur caught in the splintered remains of a log. There are signs of a struggle here, but not just the mother. Look at these smaller prints. The cubs scattered when the machines came. The bobcat limped forward, pawing at a torn piece of fabric caught beneath some debris. Daniel carefully extracted it, another fragment that matched the one she had given him earlier. But this time he noticed something more. Tiny paw prints in the dirt, alongside small human footprints. The girl, he breathed, understanding dawning. She found one of the cubs after the den was destroyed. She must have tried to help it. Leona nodded, her expression grim. That's why the mother came to you. She wasn't just injured and desperate. She was trying to tell us about both of them, her cub and the child who tried to save it. The bobcat's earlier actions took on new meaning. Her grip on his boot hadn't been random. It had been deliberate. A mother's last attempt to protect. It's not only her own offspring, but also the human child who had shown kindness to her baby. Daniel stood slowly, overwhelmed by the weight of this revelation. 2 innocent lives had been thrown into chaos by Raynors. Ruthless expansion, a wounded animal and a lost child. Their fates now mysteriously intertwined. The scrap of fabric in his hand felt heavier than before, carrying the responsibility of both stories. She's been tracking them, Leona realized aloud. Even with her injuries, she's been trying to find them both. The bobcat swayed on her feet, her strength visibly fading. Yet her eyes remained fixed on Daniel, filled with an almost human urgency. Yes. She had chosen him, trusted him, to continue what she could no longer do herself. We're looking at the same crime from 2 different angles, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. Raynor's men destroyed this den, probably sent the girl and her family running too. Now they're both out here somewhere, lost and scared. Leona touched his arm gently. The mother bobcat knew exactly what she was doing when she found you. Recognized something in you, maybe the same kind of determination she has. Daniel knelt beside the wounded animal, seeing her now not just as a desperate creature, but as a fellow protector. She had fought against the machines, against the men who threatened her family, and even against her own failing body to find help. Her resilience struck a deep chord within him. I understand now, he said softly to the bobcat. I'll find them, both of them. The animal's eyes seemed to hold his gaze for a long moment, as if judging the truth of his promise. Then she lowered herself to the ground, her breathing labored but steady. She had brought them this far, shown them what they needed to see. The rest would be up to them. Leona was already examining the surrounding area with renewed purpose. Tracks are fresher than the others. They lead further into the canyon. Daniel stood, his determination hardening into something unshakable. The bobcat's plea had transformed his mission. What had started as a strange encounter with a wounded animal had become a sacred trust, a promise to protect those who had been cast aside by men like Raynor. We need to hurry, he said, studying the lengthening shadows on the canyon walls. They're out here somewhere, and they're running out of time. The bobcat watched them prepare to move on, her role in their journey coming to an end. But her message had been delivered, her purpose fulfilled. In Daniel, she had found someone who would carry on her fight, someone who understood that the fate of a lost child and an orphaned cub were 2 threads of the same story. Woven together by circumstance and compassion, the shack appeared through. The dense trees like a shadow, a rickety structure of weathered wood and rusted metal that seemed ready to collapse. Daniel approached cautiously, his boots crunching on frozen leaves. Leona stayed close behind, her breath visible in the cold. Air! Hello? Daniel called softly. Anyone here? A small whimper answered from inside, followed by a scratching sound. Daniel's heart quickened. He moved toward the door, testing each step on the creaking porch boards. The door wasn't locked, just stuck from disuse. It groaned open to reveal a dim interior thick with dust and cobwebs. There, huddled in the furthest corner, was a small figure clutching something furry to her chest. "It's okay," Daniel said gently, keeping his distance. "We're here to help." The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her face streaked with tears and grime. In her arms, she held a young bobcat cub that watched them with its mother's same amber eyes. Leona stepped forward slowly, her voice warm and steady. "You must be so scared, but you're safe now. We've been looking everywhere for you." The girl's lip trembled. Are you going to take him away?" She hugged the cub tighter. "No," Daniel assured her, kneeling down to her level. "We know his. Mother, she's the one who helped us find you." It seemed to break through the girl's fear. "The big cat? She's alive?" Hope flickered in her eyes. "She is. She came to us for help." Daniel held out his hand. "I'm Daniel, and this is Leona." "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "They came with big machines. They knocked down everything. My dad tried to stop them, but..." Fresh tears welled up. "It's not your fault," Leona soothed. "None of this is your fault, but we need to get you somewhere safe." Sarah looked down at the cub. "I couldn't leave him. They destroyed his home too. He was all alone, like me." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "You did a brave thing, helping him. But now we need to help both of you." They managed to coax Sarah to her feet. The cub, though wild, seemed to have bonded with her and allowed itself to be carried. Daniel wrapped his jacket around Sarah's shoulders, while Leona shared some water and trail mix from her pack. "We'll take the river route," Daniel decided. "It's faster, and I've got a small boat stashed near the bend." They had only made it halfway to the river when they heard engines in the distance. Sarah froze, clutching the cub closer. "It's them," she whispered. "Mr. Rayner's men." "Run," Daniel commanded, taking Sarah's free hand. "Stay close." They crashed through the underbrush, the sound of approaching vehicles growing louder. The river came into view, a dark ribbon of water cutting through the landscape. Daniel's boat was there, hidden under branches. "Get in, quick." He helped Sarah and Leona aboard, then shoved them away from the bank. The current caught them immediately, pulling them into deeper water. The shots came without warning, sharp cracks that echoed off the canyon walls. Daniel ducked low, using his body to shield Sarah and the cub. Leona grabbed the oars, trying to steady their course. "Hold on," she yelled as they hit a stretch of rapids. The boat bucked and spun. More shots rang out. One splintered the gunwale near Daniel's hand. Another punched through the bottom of the boat. Water began seeping in. "We're taking on water," Leona shouted above the roar of the rapids. Daniel looked ahead and his heart sank. The current was pulling them toward a fallen tree that stretched across the river like a barrier. Before he could warn the others, they slammed into it broadside. The impact threw them all into the freezing water. Daniel surfaced, gasping, immediately searching for Sarah. He spotted her a few yards away, still clutching the cub as she struggled to stay afloat. "I've got you," he called, swimming toward her with powerful strokes. The cold bit into his muscles, making every movement a fight. The current dragged them further downstream, away from Rayner's men but into increasingly dangerous waters. Leona appeared beside them, helping to keep Sarah's head above water. "The bank," Daniel shouted through chattering teeth. "We need to get to the bank." More shots echoed behind them, but they were wild now, the shooters unable to get a clear aim through the trees and mist. The immediate danger was the water itself, dark, cold, and unforgiving as it pulled them deeper into the canyon. The three of them struggled against the current, protecting Sarah and her precious cargo as they fought their way toward safety. But the water's grip was strong. The shore seemed impossibly far away as the frigid river carried them further into uncertainty. The freezing water felt like thousands of needles piercing Daniel's skin. Each desperate breath burned in his lungs as the current threw him against hidden rocks. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, arms and legs growing heavier with each stroke. "Sarah," he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the roar of the rapids. 20 feet ahead, he caught glimpses of her dark hair bobbing in the white water. The cub was no longer in her arms somehow, separated in their desperate struggle. Leona's voice came from somewhere behind him. "Daniel, the rocks." He twisted just in time to avoid smashing into a jutting boulder, but the maneuver sent him spinning. When he finally righted himself, Sarah was nowhere in sight. Panic clawed at his chest. "No, no, no," he gasped, fighting against the current. His waterlogged clothes dragged at him like lead weights. Each stroke forward seemed to pull him 2 steps back. Through the spray, he spotted movement on the shore. Cliff Raynor and his men had followed the river's course, keeping pace with the struggling swimmers. Their dark figures moved between the trees, weapons glinting in the filtered sunlight. A small head broke the surface 30 feet downstream. Sarah thrashed weakly, clearly losing strength. "Help." She managed before going under again. Daniel drove himself forward with renewed desperation, but his body was failing. The cold had seeped into his bones, making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He was drowning, and Sarah was slipping away. Just then, a blur of tawny fur exploded from the shoreline. A wounded bobcat, who had been following them all this time, launched herself at Cliff Raynor with her last reserves of strength. Her claws found purchase in his chest and face as she knocked him backward. Cliff's scream of pain, a surprise cut through the river's roar. His men turned their attention to their boss, momentarily forgetting about the people in the water. The bobcat, despite her injuries, fought with the fury of a mother protecting her young one last time. That moment was all Daniel needed. With his remaining strength, he pushed through the current toward Sarah's limp form. His fingers brushed her shirt once, twice, before finally catching hold. He pulled her close, supporting her head above water as he kicked toward the shoreline. "Hey. Got her!" he shouted to Leona, who was fighting her way toward them. "Get to the bank!" The current helped now, pushing them toward a gentler slope where the river widened. Daniel's feet finally found purchase on the rocky bottom. He half-dragged, half-carried Sarah onto the muddy bank, where she immediately began coughing up water. On the opposite shore, the bobcat's attack had created chaos. Cliff struggled to throw her off, but even mortally wounded, she held on with supernatural determination. Her amber eyes locked with Daniel's across the water, a final knowing look that seemed to say, "Save them both." Then Cliff's men opened fire. The bobcat's body jerked as the bullets found their mark, but she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her sacrifice had given them the precious moments needed to reach safety. Daniel pulled Sarah further up the bank as Leona stumbled, out of the water beside them. The girl was shivering violently but alive. In the distance, they heard vehicles starting up. Cliff and his men were retreating, likely to seek medical attention. "The cub," Sarah whispered through chattering teeth. "Where's the cub?" "Weak." Mewling answered her question. The small creature had somehow made it to shore downstream, dragging itself onto a fallen log. Leona carefully retrieved it, bringing it back to Sarah's waiting arms. Daniel looked across the river one last time. The bobcat's body lay still on the opposite bank, her fur dark with blood, but her final mission accomplished. She had protected both her cub and the child until the very end. Giving her life so they might live, Sarah hugged the cub close. Tears mixing with river water on her cheeks. "She saved us," she said softly, "just like she saved him." Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The bobcat's sacrifice would stay with him forever, a reminder that even the smallest and most wounded among them could show extraordinary courage when protecting those they loved. The bitter aftermath of the river rescue hung heavy in the air as Daniel wrapped the shivering girl in his jacket. Her small frame trembled, but her grip on the bobcat cub never wavered. Leona worked quickly, starting a fire in the old ranger's cabin they'd found refuge in, while Daniel tried to process everything they'd witnessed. "We need to document everything," Leona said firmly, pulling out her phone. "Every bit of evidence matters now." Daniel nodded, his jaw set with determination. They had come too far to let Raynor slip away from justice. The girl sat close to the fire, her dark hair still dripping, but her eyes were sharp and alert as she watched them. "Can you tell us what happened?" Daniel asked gently, kneeling beside her. "About the men who came to your home?" the girl stroked. The cub's fur, finding comfort in its presence. They came with big machines, she whispered. Yellow ones. They knocked down everything, even the trees where the bobcats lived. Mama Bobcat tried to protect her babies. Leona recorded every word, while Daniel carefully photographed the girls' torn clothes and the scratches from their ordeal. They needed proof of every detail. The next morning, Daniel and Leona began methodically building their case. They drove back to the destroyed den site, documenting the devastation. Crushed branches and scattered debris told the story of violent displacement. Daniel's experienced eyes traced the path of destruction-splintered trees, gouged earth, and the unmistakable tracks of heavy machinery.
Ats! Look at this!
Leona called out, holding up a piece of paper half buried in the mud. It was a notice of eviction dated just 3 days earlier. With Rayner's company letterhead clearly visible, they worked tirelessly, gathering photographs, video footage, and physical evidence. The girl's testimony, though painful to hear, provided the human element that couldn't be ignored. She spoke of nights spent hiding, of watching her family's belongings being destroyed, and of finding the orphaned Cubbin, another victim of Rayner's ruthless expansion. When they approached the state investigators, they faced initial resistance, but Leona's connections in wildlife conservation opened doors that the local sheriff had tried to keep closed. The evidence was too compelling to dismiss. This goes beyond simple property disputes, the lead investigator said, reviewing their documentation. We're looking at environmental violations, child endangerment, and criminal negligence. Just as the investigation gained momentum, Rayner made his final desperate move. Daniel was walking to his truck one evening when he heard the familiar sound of boots on gravel. Turning, he found himself facing Rayner and 2 of his men. You should have stayed invisible, Hargrave, Rayner sneered, his face twisted with rage. Some things are bigger than your bleeding heart. But this time, Daniel stood his ground. Nothing's bigger than the truth, Rayner, and yours is about to come out. As if on cue, police vehicles emerged from the darkness, their lights cutting. Through the dusk, state troopers surrounded the area, their presence a testament to how far the investigation had already progressed. Rayner's face drained of color as he realized his empire was crumbling. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoing like final punctuation to his reign of cruelty. The evidence was irrefutable. Photos of the destroyed habitat, documentation of illegal evictions, the girl's testimony, and countless other pieces formed a damning picture. Rayner's web of influence, built on intimidation and corruption, unraveled rapidly. The local newspaper's headline said it all. Land Baron's empire falls. Criminal charges filed in displacement case. Sheriff Mays, too, faced investigation for his role in covering up Rayner's activities. As Daniel watched Rayner being led away, he felt the weight of the past weeks lift slightly. Justice had finally caught up with the man who had caused so much pain. The girl clutched his hand, the bobcat cub still nestled in her arms, both survivors of Rayner's cruelty. Both now free from his shadow, the evidence they had gathered exposed. Not just one man's crimes, but an entire system of corruption and exploitation. Rayner's arrest was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. His investigations expanded to reveal the full scope of his illegal activities. Daniel looked at the girl. Beside him, her face showing the first real smile he'd seen since finding her. The cub purred softly in her arms, a sound of contentment that seemed to echo the changing tide of justice. The autumn wind whispered through the Montana pines. But this time, it carried hope instead of loneliness. Daniel stood on his front porch, watching as the girl, now his daughter, played with the bobcat cub in the yard.
Ow.
The sight still took his breath away, even after the adoption papers had been signed and officially filed last week. Sarah, he called out softly, trying the name she had finally shared with them. It felt right on his tongue, like it belonged there all along. Shh. She looked up, her dark hair catching the sunlight, no longer tangled, but neatly braided by the kind. Ladies at the church who had taken them under their wing. The cub, now nearly twice its original size, bounded alongside her with playful energy. They had named him Scout, a tribute to his mother's bravery and sacrifice. Scout had grown strong under their care, though he would never be fully wild. Bond with Sarah was too deep, forged in their shared trauma and survival. "Time for lunch," Daniel said, watching as both girl and cub raced toward the porch. The house felt different now, transformed from a silent shelter into a real home. Pictures hung on the walls, Sarah's drawings. Photographs of their growing family, and one special image of the mother bobcat that Leona had taken before everything changed. Inside, the kitchen table that had known only solitary meals now hosted daily conversations. Sarah's schoolbooks lay scattered across one end, while Scout's feeding bowl sat in the corner. The changes went beyond the physical. Daniel found himself speaking more, laughing more, living more fully than he ever had before. "Can we walk too?" "The ridge after lunch?" Sarah asked, settling into her chair. Her voice, once barely a whisper, grew stronger each day. "I want to show Scout where the wildflowers are starting to bloom." Daniel nodded, his heart full. These simple requests, this easy trust, they were gifts he never thought he'd receive. The court proceedings had been surprisingly smooth, thanks to Leona's continued support and the community that had rallied around them. The judge had seen what everyone else now saw, a man who had risked everything to save a child, and a child who had found her protector. After sandwiches and milk, they set out across the ranch. Daniel's boots left firm prints in the spring mud, while Sarah's smaller footsteps danced alongside them. Scout prowled through the grass, occasionally pouncing on unseen movements, but never straying far from Sarah's side. As they climbed the gentle slope toward the ridgeline, Daniel reflected on how much had changed. The ranch hands, who had once barely nodded in his direction, now tipped their hats with respect. The sheriff's replacement regularly stopped by for coffee. Even the town gossips had transformed their whispers into words of praise. At the top of the ridge, they paused. The valley stretched out below them, painted in the rich colors of early spring. Sarah reached for Daniel's hand, a gesture that still surprised and moved him. Scout settled at their feet, his spotted coat gleaming in the afternoon light. "Dad," Sarah said, testing the word carefully. "Do you think she can see us, Scouts?" "Mama." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I think she can. And I think she'd be proud of how you've taken care of her little one." They stood together, their silhouettes clear against the Montana sky, a man who had found his voice, a girl who had found her home, and a cub who connected them both to a legacy of courage and sacrifice. The wind carried the scent of pine and promise, wrapping around this newly formed family like a blessing. The invisible ranch hand had become a father. The lost girl had found her protector. And together they had created something beautiful from the ashes of Lhasa, family bound not by blood, but by the deeper ties of choice, courage, and love. Scouts rumbled through the peaceful moment, a sound that seemed to echo the contentment in all their hearts. They were home, they were together, and they were whole. If this story found you at the right moment, subscribe and stay close. Tomorrow's may be the reminder you didn't know you needed.